The next exposure mode is Aperture Priority mode, which is on your mode dial as either A or AV on some cameras. In Aperture Priority mode, you are in direct control of that aperture side of that exposure triangle. So you're going to tell the camera which aperture you want to control your depth of field, and it's going to do whatever it needs to do with the shutter speed to give you a good exposure. And if you are in auto ISO, the camera is also going to do whatever it needs to do with the ISO to give you a good exposure. Or if you prefer to be in manual ISO, you're going to control the aperture and the ISO, and then the camera is going to do whatever it needs to do with the shutter speed to give you the exposure that you set with that exposure compensation dial. So Aperture Priority mode is probably the most favored mode among travel photographers. I know that's the mode that I'm in nearly 95% of the time, if not more than that, because for us, depth of field is really what's important in travel photography. Either isolating our subject by blurring the background where we're going to set a very large aperture or a small f number, or we want all of that scene from the foreground to the background in focus, so we're going to set a very small aperture or a very large f number to get a deep depth of field. And that's what most travel photographers are primarily concerned with, and that's why we mostly stay in Aperture Priority mode most of the time. So to get into Aperture Priority mode, again, all you need to do is set that mode dial to A or AV, and then adjust your aperture control as necessary to get that depth of field that you want, and then adjust your exposure compensation dial to make that photo brighter or darker. On Fujifilm cameras, you're just going to set the shutter speed to A, your ISO to A or whatever ISO that you want, and then adjust your aperture control ring to give you the aperture that you want. Now, if I want to isolate my subject, like this penguin, then I'm going to go into Aperture Priority mode with a large aperture or a small f number. I'm going to set that. Then I'm going to set my brightness with the exposure compensation dial. And the final step here is to make sure that your focus point is set on your subject. Because with such a shallow, narrow depth of field, you really have a razor thin margin for focus error. So you really need to make sure that your focus is nailed. For people or animals, the closest eye is usually what you want to focus on. Now, if I had botched my focus point on this and instead focused on the close portion of the rock that this penguin was standing on at this aperture, then the penguin would be out of focus. There are some things that you really need to look out for in Aperture Priority mode, and this actually bites a lot of photographers. It bit me for the longest time, which is why I fell in love with Auto ISO. And what happens is, if you have an aperture that's too small, so a very large f number because you want a deep depth of field, the camera is going to need to slow down that shutter speed considerably to make up for that light so that you can get the exposure that you want. So what can happen is that shutter speed can be so slow that whatever moving objects are in front of your lens can now become blurry. Or if you're holding that camera by hand, you're going to be shaking even if you don't know it while that shutter is open, and the entire photo is going to be blurry. So again, that's why I love Auto ISO. I tell the camera never go below 1/200th of a second so that I can get a sharp photo and just stay within up to a maximum ISO of 6400 to make that happen. And the camera is going to do whatever it needs to do with that ISO up to 6400 to give me a minimum shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. So if you're not using Auto ISO, if you do program a small aperture or a large f number to get a deep depth of field, you need to get in the habit of looking at your shutter speed to make sure it's not too slow. If it is too slow, you'll need to raise your ISO in order to make that shutter speed faster so that you can get a sharp image. And this is really only a concern if you are hand holding the camera or there's something moving in front of your lens. If you're on a tripod and there's nothing moving in front of you, then you can really go as slow as you want. Another error that can happen is if you have a wide open aperture and a higher ISO value on a bright sunny day, that shutter speed can't move fast enough to block that light entering that lens and coming through the sensor. So in that case, your photo is going to be overexposed, and cameras, most of them are going to tell you this with a blinking shutter speed in the screen. So if you see this, lower the ISO if you can, or you may be forced to close the aperture by a few stops.